All right, so we can begin. We are going to look at anatomy of the mediastinum. Then we also look at anatomy of the heart or the cardiovascular system in general. So we'll start with the mediastinum. In the mediastinum, we are going to learn the following. We are going to define what the mediastinum is and state its content, its extents. We're also going to see how we divide the mediastinum into the different parts. We have different parts of the mediastinum. So we look at the division of the mediastinum. Then for each division of the mediastinum, we are going to look at the contents, which structures are found in each part of the mediastinum. Then we'll talk about the thoracic inlet and the structures that go through the thoracic inlet. We'll also talk about the thoracic diaphragm and the structures that go through the thoracic diaphragm. We may have already talked about thoracic diaphragm when we mentioned about the respiratory system. So let's start with the first agenda there, which is to define the mediastinum and stating its extents. The mediastinum is defined as this region within the thoracic cavity between the right and the left lung. So understand that is within the thoracic cavity, which means it is inside the thorax. But also understand that it is between the right and the left lung, which means that the lungs are not in the mediastinum. The lungs are not in the mediastinum. It is the region between the lungs. So this is what we are calling the mediastinum. The upper part of the mediastinum is what we call the thoracic inlet, in as much as that thoracic inlet might now extend even beyond the mediastinum. The lower part will be the diaphragm here. So the mediastinum extends from anteriorly the sternum to posteriorly the thoracic spine, which means that the sternum is not again a content of the mediastinum, but it is a boundary of the mediastinum. Superiorly, it extends from the thoracic inlet. The thoracic inlet is that region bounded by the first rib, the region that enters the thorax, bounded by the first rib. That is what we call thoracic inlet. It's a connection between the thorax and the neck. Inferiorly, the mediastinum ends at the diaphragm. So those are the extents of the mediastinum. Now, we are going to talk about the second agenda, which is to outline the divisions of the mediastinum. We are also going to handle the third objective there, where we are going to list the contents of each division of the mediastinum, having defined what the mediastinum is. So if you take an imaginary line through the sternal angle, you take a plane through the thorax, that plane will cut through the junction between the fourth and the fifth thoracic vertebra. So that plane there is what we use to divide the mediastinum into two. The region above that is considered to be in the superior mediastinum, and the region below that one is considered to be in the inferior mediastinum. Let's start with the superior mediastinum. So, having said that this is the superior mediastinum, what are the boundaries of the superior mediastinum? It will extend from the manubrium of the sternum. Remember, the sternal angle is the junction between the manubrium and the body. So if the plane passed through the sternal angle, then it means that the anterior boundary of the superior mediastinum is the manubrium of the sternum. And posteriorly, it will end at the upper four thoracic vertebrae. Superiorly, it will begin from the thoracic inlet, which is up here, the region bounded by the first rib, and inferiorly, it will end at this plane, the plane of the sternal angle. So those are the boundaries of the superior mediastinum. What are the contents of the superior mediastinum? So the superior mediastinum has a number of structures. One is the aortic arc and its branches. Understand that from the heart, we have the aorta. So the aorta goes up, then turns, then goes down. The part of the aorta going up is called the ascending aorta. That one is considered to be in the inferior mediastinum. But when the aorta is turning, the arc is considered to be in the superior mediastinum. So this is the arc of the aorta. The descending aorta is also in the inferior mediastinum. So only the arc of the aorta goes beyond the plane of the sternal angle. So only the arc is part of the superior mediastinum. The arc of the aorta has 3 branches. And so those branches are also part of the superior mediastinum. The first branch of the arc is the brachiocephalic trunk. You can call it brachiocephalic artery. This one gives you the right subclavian artery, which is this one, and the right common carotid, which is that one. The second branch of this arc of the aorta is the left common carotid, and the third branch is the left subclavian. So those branches of the arc of the aorta are also within the mediastinum, superior mediastinum. Apart from that, we also have the superior vena cava being part of the superior mediastinum, and the veins that form the superior vena cava, which means the right and the left brachiocephalic veins. The right brachiocephalic vein comes from the right side of the upper part of the body, carrying blood from the head and neck region as well as upper limb. And the same as the left one, coming from blood that is coming from the left upper limb and the left head and neck region. So the vein from the left and the vein from the right meet to form the superior vena cava, and they are still within the superior mediastinum. The third content within the superior mediastinum is the trachea, which is the part followed by air. And behind the trachea, we have the esophagus. So the esophagus is the food pipe, of course, you know that, and trachea is the windpipe. Of course, you know that the trachea is going to the lungs, while the esophagus is going to the stomach. The thymus is also a content of the superior mediastinum. This is the thymus. So usually the thymus is located both in the superior mediastinum as well as in the inferior mediastinum. So there's a part of it in the superior mediastinum. There's a part of it in the inferior mediastinum. That is the thymus. Apart from the thymus, we also have maybe before I go to the thoracic duct, while we're on the thymus, someone to tell me the function of the thymus. Okay, let me give it to Florence. Florence, are you in class? Okay, Florence a bit away. Agnes, you're the first person to join the class. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right, sister. So tell us, what is the function of the thymus?
Can't remember.
Okay. All right. So there's this person called, hey, Eugenia Ningumu, Tribian. Tribian, are you in class? Okay, let me leave it open. So who wants to attempt?
I want to attempt.
Yes, Anne, thank you. You always come to my rescue. I really appreciate. Asante sana. Yes, Anne.
I think it's something to do with the immunity and T cells, maturity, something like that.
Yes, that's true. That the thymus is important in enabling maturation of the T lymphocytes, and that helps in the immune system. You're right. So it's a site of maturation of T lymphocytes. Actually, that is why T lymphocytes are called T for thymus. We have the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct is a lymphatic channel that carries lymph from the lower part of the body to take it to the left side. This is the thoracic duct. It's carrying lymph from the lower part of the body and takes to the junction between the left subclavian vein and the left internal jugular vein. That's where lymph goes back to the circulation. So it's a lymphatic channel. Then there are a number of nerves which are also in the superior mediastinum. The phrenic nerve is the nerve that goes to the diaphragm. So if you have injury to the phrenic nerve, then you can paralyze the diaphragm. The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, going to supply various organs of the respiratory system, digestive system, cardiovascular system, and urinary system. We can ignore that one. The recurrent laryngeal nerve is a branch of vagus nerve. It goes to the larynx. Then you have the sympathetic chain. The sympathetic chain, as the name suggests, is a chain of the sympathetic nerves that go to different parts of the body. This is the sympathetic chain. This is the vagus nerve. So all those structures are within the superior mediastinum. So in an exam, I wouldn't really ask you to name all the contents of the superior mediastinum. You won't finish. And I am also unlikely to ask you the following are contents of the superior mediastinum except, although you may be asked, but that's a direct recall. In an exam setup, you'll be asked more of a clinical question. A patient has a tumor in the superior mediastinum. Which of the following clinical symptoms is the patient likely to present with? So you have to look at the structures within the superior mediastinum, then you think about obstruction or pressure on those structures. Then you think about the functions of those structures. So for example, if a patient has a tumor rising from the thymus, you need to compress the structures within the superior mediastinum. Now you need to figure out, so what are the symptomatology that this patient is going to present with in terms of pressure symptoms? If they are unable to swallow properly, it will make sense because there's compression to the esophagus. If they're unable to breathe well, it will also make sense because there's compression to the trachea. If there's a lot of engorgement of veins in the upper part of the body, it should also make sense because there's compression to the superior vena cava. So that's what we call superior vena cava syndrome. So you should be able to think through that in a clinical way. That is superior mediastinum. Now let's talk about the inferior mediastinum. We say that the region below this plane is what we are calling the inferior mediastinum. Therefore, we can say that the inferior mediastinum extends from the body of the sternum anteriorly up to the vertebral column posteriorly, except now we are looking at the lower 8 thoracic vertebrae, because the upper 4 are behind in the superior mediastinum. From above, we can say that the inferior mediastinum extends from the plane of the sternal angle up to the level of the thoracic diaphragm. We divide the inferior mediastinum into 3 based on the location of the heart. Where the heart is located is considered to be in the middle mediastinum. So the region in front of the heart is then considered to be in the anterior mediastinum, and the region behind the heart is considered to be in the posterior mediastinum. Let's look at each of those components of the inferior mediastinum. We start with the anterior mediastinum, which is this region. So anterior mediastinum extends from the sternum here up to the anterior pericardium. Pericardium being the covering of the heart. So this is the anterior mediastinum. What structures are in the anterior mediastinum? We have the thymus there still. I told you that thymus extends from superior to inferior. So specifically, inferiorly, it extends into the anterior mediastinum. Anna has told us the role of thymus. That function of thymus is important during childhood. Beyond the age of 9, that function is already achieved. And so what happens is that the thymus usually involutes, it regresses, it goes away, it is replaced by fibrofatty tissue. So you and I most likely don't have a thymus per se, but we have a remnant of the thymus. But we may still have some rudimentary thymic tissue. Children have a bigger thymus. There are some lymph nodes which are also within the anterior mediastinum. These are some of the key lymph nodes that drain the breast tissue. We call them parasternal lymph nodes. Then the blood vessels, which also supply the breast, also run here. We call them internal mammary vessels. They supply the breast. So that is anterior mediastinum. How about the middle mediastinum? So I told you that the region of the heart is what is considered to be middle mediastinum. So the structures within the middle mediastinum will then be the heart itself and the coverings of the heart, which we are calling pericardium. Apart from that, we also have the root of the great vessels. What are we calling great vessels? We are referring to the aorta. So the root of the aorta is that thing we are calling the ascending aorta. Another great vessel is this one. Let's call it the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary trunk. We can also talk about the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, slightly for the inferior vena cava, because the heart usually rests in the diaphragm. And so the inferior vena cava, immediately it passes the diaphragm, it enters the heart. So very small part of the inferior vena cava is being visualized within the mediastinum. But as a matter of concept, we will consider that it is also a great vessel. The phrenic nerves beyond the superior mediastinum, they also pass through the middle mediastinum so that they can reach the diaphragm. And the root of the lungs are also within the middle mediastinum. Remember, the root of the lungs refer to the structures that enter through the hilum of the lung. So it will contain the pulmonary arteries, the right and the left one, or rather the left one for the left lung and the right one for the right lung. It will also contain the principal bronchi. It will contain the bronchial arteries that's going to each lung. So like here, this is the root of this left lung. This is the root of that right lung. As those structures go to the lungs, they must pass through the mediastinum. And that is why they are part of the mediastinum. That is middle mediastinum. Now let's talk about the posterior mediastinum. So based on our definition, the posterior mediastinum is a region behind the pericardium. This region contains the descending aorta. So understand again that from the heart, the aorta has an ascending part which lies within the middle mediastinum. That's what we call the root of the aorta. Then we have the arc of the aorta, which is in the superior mediastinum. having those three branches, then we have the descending aorta, which is in the posterior mediastinum. Apart from descending aorta, we also have the esophagus. Of course, the esophagus will be coming all the way from the pharynx, going through the superior mediastinum, and then go through posterior mediastinum to go to the stomach. The thoracic duct that I mentioned earlier also runs within the posterior mediastinum, usually behind the esophagus. The vagus nerve, as it's going to the GIT, it will pass through the posterior mediastinum. Sympathetic chain, as it traverses the chest, it will be going through the posterior mediastinum. The azygous venous system refers to the system of veins that drain the chest wall. These veins that drain the chest wall, they are formed by the intercostal veins. The intercostal veins join to form the azygous venous system. So these azygous venous system are also part of the posterior mediastinum. Great, so that is posterior mediastinum, and that summarizes the story of the divisions and contents of each mediastinum. Now let's talk about the boundaries and contents of the thoracic inlet. The thoracic inlet is bounded by the first rib laterally. So you'll have the first rib. This is the first rib laterally. Then posteriorly, you have the first thoracic vertebra. And anteriorly, we have the manubrium of the sternum. So this region that connects the neck with the thorax is what you are calling the thoracic inlet. Indeed, there are a number of structures that will go through the thoracic inlet. Most of them are contents of the superior mediastinum. And again, that should make sense. If something is in the superior mediastinum and it's going to the neck, definitely it has to go through the thoracic inlet. There are a few structures that are in the superior mediastinum, but they don't go through the thoracic inlet because they're not in the neck. Like the arc of the aorta, it will not go through. So in as much as it was a content of the superior mediastinum, it's not a content of the thoracic inlet, but the branches of the arc of the aorta are within the thoracic inlet. Things like the thymus may not reach much above, although in a child, it might extend up to the neck. But in an adult, it may not extend up to the neck. All those nerves we talked about will also be there. But importantly also, our definition of mediastinum is that the mediastinum is a region between the two lungs. So this would be the mediastinum. However, the apices of the lungs, in as much as they are not contents of the mediastinum, they are contents of the thoracic inlet. This is to mean that the lungs extend a little into the neck. And that's important for you to note as a clinician, because it means if there's a penetrating injury at the root of the neck, then you can actually introduce pneumothorax. So that is thoracic inlet. Now let's finish with the structures that go through the thoracic diaphragm. Something tells me we've done this before, but let me just take you through it. Good, and I'm actually taking you through it by asking you a question first. So this is good for me. Right, so there's a question projected on your screen. I want anyone to attempt it. So you'll give us your response and perhaps a reason why you've chosen what you've chosen. So anyone, feel free to give your comment. Kwani bado mnaisoma? Okay, so James is saying E. James, tell us why you've chosen E. James? Yes, James, tell us why you've chosen E.
I've chosen E because all the other structures will traverse the thoracic diaphragm.
So what makes you think that the inferior vena cava should not traverse the thoracic diaphragm?
With the inferior vena cava, my answer was not in the inferior vena cava.
Oh, okay, it's just thoracic duct. Okay, all right, yes. Thoracic. Yeah, but I told you that thoracic duct carry lymph from the lower part of the body. And we've seen it in the posterior mediastinum. So it has to go through the thoracic diaphragm. So that one is not a correct response. Sawa, James?
Yes, nimeelewa.
Okay, Florence, I can see through your private message, you've said F. Maybe give us a reason why you've chosen F, Florence. So you're the one who was chosen inferior vena cava. Florence? Okay. I'm unable to get Florence. John has chosen boy. So John, tell us why you've chosen boy.
I've chosen B. Is trachea because it's the weed pipe.
Yes.
And we saw that it's supposed to be. It was where? It's not supposed to go through the diaphragm because it supplies the lungs.
Very good. So yeah, the correct answer here is the trachea. Yes, we all know that the trachea goes to the lungs. So if you're insisting that trachea goes through the thoracic diaphragm, you're in otherwise telling this team that the trachea goes to the abdomen. And you know, that will not be a human being. Eh? That will not be a human being. Eh? Okay. Okay. Right. So thoracic diaphragm is a dome-shaped muscle. It separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. So above it is the thoracic cavity, below it is the abdominal cavity. There are three openings within the diaphragm. We have the cable opening. That's the highest opening. The cable opening corresponds with the level of the 8th thoracic vertebra, T8. As the name suggests, the cable opening is for the passage of the inferior vena cava. It should make sense that inferior vena cava takes blood from the lower part of the body to the heart. So it has to go through the thoracic diaphragm. It will go through at the level of cable opening, which corresponds to the level of the 8th thoracic vertebra. Other than the inferior vena cava, the phrenic nerve also goes through that opening. So the phrenic nerve also goes to the cable opening. The phrenic nerve supplies the diaphragm, but also supplies the capsule of the liver and biliary tree. The esophageal opening is at the level of T10. So the level of T10 is the level of the esophageal opening. That is the opening for the esophagus. So the structures that go through this one will be the esophagus itself, but we also have the vagus nerves going through that opening. Vagus nerves, the 10th cranial nerve, must go through the thoracic diaphragm to reach the organs of the abdomen. The third opening is the aortic opening at the level of T12. So it's the lowest one. It is for the opening of the descending aorta. The aorta must go through the thoracic diaphragm to come from the thorax into the abdomen. Aortic opening traverses the aorta. It also traverses the thoracic duct. Thoracic duct goes through the aortic opening. Right, so those are the openings within the thoracic diaphragm. Good. So I'm done with the mediastinum. I want to start the cardiovascular system. And maybe I'll give you a break before we start. Today I'll give you 2 breaks because the lecture will be a bit long. So this is the first break I'm giving you. Let's just take, okay, let's take 10 minutes, not a problem. So it's now 2:50. So let's come back at 3. Then we start on the cardiovascular series. Unless someone has a question.